I want to just tell you very briefly my story before we go into the presentation. I don't know how many of you have a similar story. When I was growing up in the Midwest in St. Louis as a kid, they were in the 50s, there were fumigation trucks that would go down our streets. So as kids do, we got on our bicycles and we followed them because it was fun. So we were following these plumes of pesticide. We have no idea what was in it. Don't know if that's what caused it. I was diagnosed with idiopathic Parkinson's. And a lot of what Dr. Dorsey is going to be talking about is pesticide use and how that changes, how that increases our risk for Parkinson's. So I'm going to turn it over to you and we are going to spotlight you. And there you are.
So first of all, thank you very much for having me, Sharon. Everyone calls me Ray. Delighted to be here with you. I thought I would start out with a reading from the book, given Sharon's opening. Is that all right with everyone? And then outstanding. We'll keep this informal and happy to answer any questions. I know some people are already sending questions and sent me Googling this morning. So thank you. So this is from chapter 4. It's called Before It Starts, the urgency of banning specific pesticides to lower our risk. And we start with the quote from Rachel Carson. For those of you who don't know Rachel Carson, you should read about her. Probably one of the most influential female scientists of the 20th century. In 1962, she wrote this landmark book called Silent Spring, which highlighted the downside, the health risks of indiscriminate use of pesticides, especially DDT. Because of her work, 8 years later, the EPA was formed. So we have the Environmental Protection Agency because of Rachel Carson. And in her book in 1962, well before anything was known about pesticides and Parkinson's disease, she said, the farmers spoke of much illness among their families. In the town, the doctors had become more and more puzzled by new kinds of sickness appearing among their patients. And just one aside, and I was saying, numerous studies have found that farmers and those who live in residential areas and drink well water are at 50 to 150% increased risk of Parkinson's disease. Rachel Carson foresees that 20 years, 30 years before it's known. So this is from the book. Over the past 40 years, 5 members of Terry McGrath's extended family, including her beloved grandfather, developed Parkinson's disease. In 2005, McGrath, then a 49-year-old special education teacher, noticed that when she walked, her left arm was not swinging and her left foot was dragging. 3 years later, she became the 6th member of her family and the first woman to receive the same diagnosis. In the 1920s, McGrath's grandfather, Alex Aden, and 9 of his brothers and sisters emigrated from Lithuania to the United States. Most of the sisters became seamstresses, and most of the brothers, including McGrath's grandfather, became farmers in southwestern Michigan. Ever since then, the McGrath's family life has centered on a farm in St. Joseph, a small town on the eastern shore of Lake Michigan. Her 86-year-old mother spent her entire life within 2 miles of that farm. Like Sharon, as a child, McGrath was always playing outside with her grandparents. The family regularly used pesticides on its farm, including DDT, until it was banned in the United States in 1972. When the older family members sprayed the chemicals, McGrath stayed inside because her grandmother did not want her to breathe them in. But McGrath would often soon slip outside after, while the pesticides still lingered in the air. She, her siblings, and cousins would all pick apples, currants, and grapes that were covered with a white film. Only after her diagnosis did McGrath learn how dangerous some of these pesticides were and how some were linked to Parkinson's. McGrath loved growing up on that farm. Despite her diagnosis, she says that had she known about the harmful effects of pesticides, she's not certain she would have done anything differently. Her children, who are now all super conscious of what they eat, are surprised that their mother did not think more about the risk of pesticides. McGrath says, "I just didn't think about it. I thought farming was fun." McGrath no longer lives on the farm, but her uncle and cousin do. Both are embracing organic farming. McGrath herself remains active. Now retired, she still tutors and is planning a camping trip across the Natchez Trail in the southern United States and is awaiting the birth of her 9th grandchild. Although she's doing well currently, could she and her family have avoided Parkinson's disease? The answer is likely yes. Farmers who are exposed to certain pesticides have a higher risk of developing the disease. In one study, the risk of developing the disease for farmers was 170% greater than for non-farmers. And the longer the farmers worked with the pesticides, the greater the risk. Pesticide risks are not limited to farmers. People who simply live in rural areas have high rates of Parkinson's disease. These individuals may be exposed to pesticides in the air that can drift into residential communities. In addition, pesticides can contaminate groundwater or well water. Private wells are often shallow and may be especially at risk for contamination from nearby pesticides. Moreover, in the United States, private well water is not subject to the same regulations as water that comes from the public systems. Agricultural areas have the highest rates of Parkinson's. In Nebraska, the rates of the disease are 2 to 4 times higher in the state's rural agricultural parts than in urban Omaha. In Canada, investigators have found an almost perfect correlation between areas with the highest pesticide use and the highest rates of the disease. In France, rural areas have the highest rates of Parkinson's, as do the regions with the most vineyards, which often require intense pesticide use. And then there's the rest of us. We eat fruits, vegetables, nuts, and grains every day that have been doused in pesticides. What kind of risks are we all exposed to? We do not know. Assessing pesticide exposure from foods and documenting individuals' dietary habits over a lifetime, given that Parkinson's takes decades to unfold, are challenging, but this research is needed. And until then, we are left with educated guesses. We do know that organic foods have much lower levels of pesticide residues than conventional choices. So the central thrust of the book is that Parkinson's disease is not inevitable, that Parkinson's disease is rather preventable, and that to a large extent, we have created this disease ourselves. Dr. Parkinson first described the condition in 1817, and when he described it up to that point, Parkinson's disease in all likelihood was extremely, extremely rare. He even said he was describing something that had not been classified in the medical literature. And so what's going on in London in 1817 that would make a 61-year-old doctor who's been around the block a few times catch his eye? So in London, 1817 is the height of the Industrial Revolution, and England's the capital. And the London fog had little to do with weather and everything to do with air pollution. In fact, it was so dirty that they needed torches at night to make their ways across the street. We even have a picture of the London fog. So this is from the book. The book has lots of pictures and graphs. So this is a picture of the London fog. And if you look closely, one, you notice that the only thing you can see are the torches that these young boys are carrying so that carriages and people can navigate the streets. And if you look at the husband, the wife, and their son, they're all covering their mouths because of the toxic effects of the air that they're breathing in. Air pollution since then has been linked to Parkinson's disease, as have other products and byproducts of the Industrial Revolution, including pesticides, certain industrial solvents, and heavy metals. And if you look at the rates of Parkinson's disease, not surprisingly, we find that the rates of Parkinson's disease are highest in the industrialized world, Western Europe and the United States, lowest in the least industrialized parts of the world, sub-Saharan Africa, and increasing the fastest in the areas of the world that are undergoing the most rapid industrialization, like China. So to a large extent, Parkinson's disease is a man-made disease. We have brought this on ourselves. It's not the first man-made disease, and it's not the only man-made diseases. They're all around us. Car accidents are clearly a man-made disease, as is lung cancer. Before cigarettes were introduced in the late 1800s to England, lung cancer was a once-in-a-lifetime oddity. All the doctors would gather around when there was a case was diagnosed because they never thought they would see a case. In fact, the rates of lung cancer were almost zero, just like Parkinson's disease. But when we had cigarettes, you can see 25 years after introduction of cigarettes, you see an increase in the rates of lung cancer. And when we've stopped smoking as a society, we've seen a decrease in cigarette use, and 25 years later, we see a corresponding decline in the rates of lung cancer. So the challenge to all of you, and I greatly appreciate the invitation to speak with you and happy to answer as many questions as you have, is what can we do as a generation to end Parkinson's disease? What can we do as people who know the debilitating effects of the disease best to prevent other people from developing this disease? Parkinson's is now the world's fastest growing brain disease, even faster growing than Alzheimer's. Over the last 25 years, the number of people with the disease has more than doubled. And if we don't act, if our generation does not act, if we do not act, the number of people with Parkinson's will double in the coming 25 years. So you say, well, what can we do? We as society have confronted other diseases and led to their cessation and eradication nearly. In the 1950s, some of you are aware, around the 1950s, there was a virus that caused enormous neurological effects. It was called polio. There was no treatment. It closed down swimming pools, it closed down churches, it closed down community centers, not too dissimilar from what we're experiencing here with COVID-19. But in the face of that virus, we had a president, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who may have contracted polio himself, who created something called the CDC. The Centers for Disease Control was created by FDR to help eradicate polio, and a new foundation was created. It's called the National Association for Infantile Paralysis, and became known as the March of Dimes. And a group of ordinary Americans engaged in a social media experiment to send dimes, literally mail in dimes to the White House to raise money for polio. They mailed in so many dimes, as we described in the book, it nearly shut the White House post office down. And they raised millions of dollars, and those millions of dollars enabled Jonas Salk and then later Albert Sabin to develop polio vaccines that have eradicated polio from the United States, eradicated polio from virtually every part of the world, such that there are no polio doctors, generally speaking. There are no polio centers. There's really, even the March of Dimes has, is much smaller than it once was because the disease has been addressed. That's one example. 30 years later, we were confronted with another unknown virus. It wasn't even known it was a virus. It caused a uniformly rapidly fatal disease. Unlike the response that was led by FDR at that time in the 1980s, there was no federal response. If anything, the only response was to blame the people who were contracting this unknown disease. This disease, known as AIDS, was soon found to be due to a virus called HIV. 15 years later, because of a motto adopted by the HIV community that was silence equals death. Silence equals death. And that was the motto of ACT UP, formed by the late Larry Kramer. They barricaded the streets of New York. They overtook the New York Stock Exchange. They overtook the FDA. They overtook pharmaceutical companies. Because of their activism, 15 years later, we developed drugs called protease inhibitors that have led to a near normal life expectancy for HIV. We as a country spend $3 billion a year in NIH funding on HIV research, 10 times more than we spend on Parkinson's disease, and it's had enormous benefits. There are people on this phone whose friends and family members, if not themselves, don't have HIV, do not have HIV because of the activism of HIV activists. So there are people here whose friends and families or themselves don't have HIV because a group of people in the 1980s who were marginalized adopted a motto of silence equals death, and they worked to prevent people from ever getting HIV, and they developed new and effective treatments for the disease. Today, HIV, if you have HIV, you are more likely to receive appropriate treatment for your condition than if you have Parkinson's disease. I'll say that again. Today, if you have HIV, you're more likely to receive appropriate treatment for your condition than if you have Parkinson's disease. And so we've had activism in the 1950s and 1980s, and I can give you other examples. You think about breast cancer in the 21st century that have changed the course of these diseases. The people who change the course of the diseases are not neurologists, but it are twitchy women like you who banded together and made their voices heard and said this is enough. In the response of any pandemic, the first action is to prevent other people from getting it. It's true with COVID-19. It's true with polio. And it's true with Parkinson's disease. Our first action, I know it's a generous one, is to prevent other people from getting this disease. That's the gift of the people in the March of Dimes in the 1950s. That was the gift of the activists in the 1980s with HIV, is they have prevented many of us from ever getting it. If you want to think about another example, think about MAD. So you're all women, Mothers Against Drunk Driving. Any of you who have teenage kids know that you don't need to talk to them very much about drinking and driving because it's socially unacceptable to do so. It's like they would sooner not brush their teeth than they would drink and drive. I mean, it's just part of the norms and it's not done. I took my son, who's 22, he went out with his friends last night. I drove him to the party and then he took an Uber back. I mean, just drinking, driving is just a non-issue. It's just socially unacceptable. And they have saved, again, people on this, participating in this thing have likely had people who've not been injured in a car accident because of the actions of MAD. Our challenge today, and I'm going to stop speaking in a second, is to help prevent people from ever getting Parkinson's disease in the first place and to end the disease and care for everyone affected with the disease today. With that, I'll stop and happy to take any questions that you have.
Okay, it looks like there's a lot of questions. Oh, am I on mute? No. We're having trouble streaming this on Facebook, unfortunately.
That's okay. I can see the questions. You want me to go through the questions?
If you can see the questions, yeah, let's see.
I see them.
Okay. So
then I'm going to be quiet, Sharon, and let Ray do his thing. And if there's any questions that, you know,
okay,
what reading, okay?
it works.
So thank you. First question from Lauren was, the book is well worth reading if you've not read it, very informative and a good pitch, so advocate. So can someone let me enable screen sharing? If someone, I'll show you something. So
you're good to go.
Great, thank you. And so thanks to Alistair, who's from our team, and I've been working with Sharon to bring me to you today. And so hopefully you can see my screen, Alistair. You can see my screen, okay? Yeah,
yes, we can.
So this is the book. You can buy it on Amazon right now. All the author's proceeds, all the proceeds from the authors are being donated or devoted to efforts to end Parkinson's. So none of us are taking any money from the book. All of our proceeds from Todd Scher, the CEO of the Michael J. Fox Foundation, Michael Oken, and Boss Bloom and me are going to efforts to end Parkinson's. We're devoting our proceeds to efforts to investigate the causes of Parkinson's disease, including this chemical called trichloroethylene that we can talk about later. So you can, one, if you haven't bought the book, buy the book. It's $17.89 on Amazon. If you cannot afford $17.89, and I know some of you can't, you'll email us at info@endingpd.org. Alistair will put that in the chat. info@endingpd.org. Just say, I'd like a copy of the book and give me your mailing address and we'll mail you a copy for free. So if you can't afford a copy of the book, we'll send you one because we're going to ask you to make your voices heard. So we're happy to have you, give you a free copy of the book to make your voices heard. So if the cost of the book is a concern, just email us. We'll mail you a free copy, info@endingpd.org. If you've read the book, make your voices heard. So you can just click here on Amazon on ratings and you can write a review. It doesn't matter whether you purchased the book on Amazon. You could have gotten the book in any way you wanted. Just got it, checked it from the library. Click on ratings, and you can see that we got a lot of nice ratings from a lot of people. And you can just click here and it says write a customer review. And that's it. You click how many stars you want. Maybe you give us 5 stars or 4 stars. Important book. Let's Stop TD. And then you click here and you hit submit and you're done. So it takes 2 minutes. We need to get the more reviews that we get on the book, the more awareness we get for the disease. One of the challenges, quite frankly, is that the book came out March 17th at the height of the COVID pandemic. So there was no media coverage. There weren't any events. I can't be with you in person. There weren't any bookstores. So it's been a challenge to get the word out. But I want you to get the word out. Buy the book, read the book, review the book. And if you can't afford it, info@endingpd.org. Similarly, if you have questions that we don't answer today, info@endingpd.org, and we'll do our best to answer it. Next, great book. Oh, be sure to go to Facebook and check out PD Adventures. So based on this book, Larry Gifford, who has Parkinson's disease and is a broadcaster in Canada, and his colleagues have created a group called the Parkinson's Disease Avengers, or PD Avengers. Alistair will put their website in there. If you want to make your voices heard, that's a grassroots organization. We have nothing to do with it. That has formed in response to the book. So Cheryl asked, what kind of diet do you recommend for those who do have Parkinson's disease? So the diet that's been best studied for those who do have Parkinson's disease and even for those who don't is a Mediterranean diet. So a diet high in fruits and vegetables, low in animal products, has been shown to be helpful in individuals with Parkinson's disease and been shown to perhaps decrease the risk of ever developing Parkinson's disease for those who don't have it. So Mediterranean diet would be great, high in fruits and vegetables, lots of water and lots of fiber, which are important for constipation. Cindy asks, is milk forbidden if organic or lactose free? So Cindy probably read the book, and in the book we highlight that some pesticides, so pesticides are nerve toxins. There's one called heptachlor, and heptachlor was banned by the EPA, but the pineapple farmers of Hawaii petitioned for an exemption to using heptachlor, and they were granted an exemption to using heptachlor. And they sprayed it on pineapples to protect their pineapple crops so the pests wouldn't eat their pineapples. But what they did with the pineapple tops is they fed the grassy part of the pineapple tops to cows. And they were supposed to wait a year before doing that, but they didn't wait a year. And they fed it to the cows. So the cows eat the heptachlor-laden grassy tops of the pineapples. And what do cows do with a fat-soluble pesticide? Well, they deposit it and concentrate it in fatty substances. And what fat do cows have? Milk. So then the heptachlor pesticide is now in the cow's milk. It was originally on the pineapples, now it's in the cow's milk. Well, where does the cow's milk go to? It goes to grocery stores in Hawaii. And so then what did the grocery stores in Hawaii found out that their levels of heptachlor were far above what they should have been. So they recalled the milk, but not until after a lot of milk had been drank. So one of my colleagues, Wilbur Ross and Carly Tanner, then investigated, just pure coincidence, they were doing a natural history study of people in Oahu, in Hawaii, and followed these men largely men, until they died. Lo and behold, those men who drank the highest rates had the biggest milk consumption, had the highest rates of Parkinson's disease. And then when they looked at their brains, they found that those men who drank the highest amounts of milk had the lowest amount of dopamine producing nerve cells in their brain. And what did they find in their brains? Heptachlor. So this fat soluble nerve toxin that kills nerve cells, concentrated in the cow's milk, drunk by humans, our brains are fatty, found to be in the brains of people with Parkinson's disease, and found in areas that have lost dopamine producing nerve cells, which are lost. In short, they found the smoking gun. So heptachlor is not used anymore in the United States. The United States still used in other parts of the world. And so that would be my big concern about drinking milk, is the effects of pesticides. Milk may have some other products. It may have low levels of urate. So that may worsen the rate of progression of Parkinson's disease, although that's less certain. So in general, I recommend avoiding milk if you're concerned about pesticides. I still drink chocolate milk and stuff like that, but I try to get it from farms that are much less likely to be using pesticides. So organic milk would be a better choice, for example, than ones that aren't. That said, organic products still have some pesticide residues, as some of you know. Cindy asked, another Cindy, Donahue, food being completely organic or it's too expensive. Yes, I haven't looked at that guideline in great detail myself, but I know lots of people think highly of it. And so I've started just since writing the book over the last 2 years, buying a lot more organic food. And then I wash my fruits and vegetables. You can just buy a little soap cleaner at any grocery store. And I just had berries for breakfast today with my yogurt, so I still eat dairy. And I wash my fruits and vegetables. What about tenting houses for termites? and changing oil, Linda. So 2 questions there. Pesticides widely used to get rid of pests. There's one called chlorpyrifos. We might come back to it later. Widely used to get rid of termites and other insects in New York City. It was found to be associated with lower IQ, lower intelligence among children living in those areas. Is estimated to have cost 25 million children 15 million IQ points. Again, many of these pesticides are nerve toxins, and there's an adverse effect associated with nerve toxins. So it depends on the pesticides. Not all pesticides are nerve toxins. Not all are fat soluble. Not all enter the brain. So I can't say in general for termites, but there are clearly pesticides, including chlorpyrifos, which are associated with it. And then somebody asked a question that sent me looking this morning on Senate Bill 921, which is introduced by Senator Tom Udall to protect children, farmers, and farm workers from Nerve Agent Pesticides Act. So that's been introduced into the Senate, and it's aimed at banning chlorpyrifos as well as changing regulations due to other pesticides. A critical issue, an issue that's been entirely ignored by large segments of the political spectrum, but a huge issue for people who want to stop getting Parkinson's disease. Oil. So oil, there's this other chemical called trichloroethylene, widely used degreasing agent. The New York Times said it was ubiquitous in the 1970s. It used to be used as an anesthetic. It was used to decaffeinate coffee. It was used in whiteout. If you've worked with engines or refrigerants, or in transportation, or with painting, or as a dry cleaner, or as an embalmer, you've likely been exposed to this chemical, trichloroethylene. One of my colleagues did a study of twins, and she looked at twins who had been exposed to trichloroethylene, also called TCE, or twins who were unexposed. The twins who were exposed to TCE didn't have a 5% increased risk of Parkinson's, not 15, not 50, but a 500% increased risk of Parkinson's disease among twins exposed to TCE compared to unexposed twins. 500%, 6 times higher rates of Parkinson's disease among people with exposed to disease than those. And we devote all of chapter 5 to discussing this. Also found on military bases. For those of you who follow it, Camp Lejeune is a Marine base in North Carolina in which TCE contaminated their water, covered up by the military. Not only does TCE cause Parkinson's disease, it also causes cancer. It also causes neural tube defects. There's a cemetery on that Marine base from stillborn children due to the effects of TCE. Again, a cover up by the military, been exposed by Congress and well documented and documented in our book. So I would be concerned if I were working as a mechanic in the past. TCE still not banned, been proposed to be banned, but has not been banned in the United States. Some uses are still permitted. Many countries in Western Europe have banned it. Farrell Levy asked, if we already have Parkinson's disease, is it important to eat organic? We don't know, but I would be avoiding nerve toxins if I had Parkinson's disease. Was the estimated independent effect of pesticides on Parkinson's disease? For example, if you control for age or longevity, what is found? So we know that people who live in rural areas, farmers and rural residents are, as I said earlier, at 50 to 150% increased risk for developing Parkinson's disease. 50 to 150% increased risk for developing Parkinson's disease adjusted for age. And it's worth noting that how do people get exposed to pesticides? Well, they eat it, that's one, right? And where does Parkinson's disease begin? It begins in the gut or it begins in the nose. And so some of you know that constipation is one of the early features of Parkinson's disease. It begins 10 to 20 years before the tremor that's classically associated with the disease. How else are pesticides exposed? Pesticides are also inhaled. And so not surprisingly, that loss of smell is found early in the disease. And the pathology of Parkinson's disease before it's found in the part of the brain that controls movement and slowness of movement and tremor, it's found in the nose. In addition, some of you know that Parkinson's disease is associated with an increased risk of melanoma, and pesticides, in addition to increasing your risk of Parkinson's disease, also increase your risk of skin cancer. So lots of evidence on pesticides and Parkinson's disease. I'm happy to continue on. And by the way, if you're not getting upset listening to me speaking, I'm not doing my job. You should be getting really upset about this when I'm talking about it. I got upset when I read a lot about this. We got more questions here. Let's see if I can get my cursor to work. Was it, oh, hold on. Okay, good. Okay. Pamela asked, Ray, any chance my family was exposed to pesticides or other pollutants by swimming in Lake Erie for many years? You might have been exposed to a lot of things in Lake Erie. Some of you know Lake Erie caught on fire. So I don't know about pesticides. I would probably be worried not so much from swimming in the lakes. I guess you weren't swimming in the lake, every day for long periods of time. I'd probably be worried about industrial pollutants like trichloroethylene. So trichloroethylene, TCE, is found in over half of Superfund sites throughout the United States. So Superfund sites are those designated, so polluted that they're designated for cleanup. Unless you think this is only in Lake Erie, the place in the country that's the most Superfund sites is in Silicon Valley, because TCE was used to clean silicon wafers and widely used in the chip manufacturing industry. And as some of you know, Andy Grove died of Parkinson's disease. Andy Grove, the founder of Intel. And so this is a map of all the Superfund sites. There are 21 in Silicon Valley, in Mountain View, Santa Clara, and Sunnyvale. And this is a map of 15 of the 21, all found in Silicon Valley. So this is some of the most expensive real estate in the country, if not the world. And it's all sitting on top of Superfund sites contaminated with a chemical that's been known to cause Parkinson's and cancer. This woman, Jane Horton, she lives across the street from the headquarters of Google. And Google is built on a Superfund site that was contaminated with TCE by Intel and Fairchild Semiconductor. And she found that the TCE, it gets poured, inappropriately disposed of often, i.e. they pour it into the ground. It then goes into the ground and then contaminates the groundwater and then can form underground plumes and then evaporate into your home. So TCE evaporated into her home, much like radon does from the soil. And she was found to have high levels of TCE. So she had a system, a TCA remediation system put into her house that sucked the air from underneath her house and emits the TCE contaminated air above her house. I found, and I described in the book, a TCE contaminated site 15 minutes from where I live in a suburban Rochester. A site near a gravel pit was contaminated with TCE, and people were drinking water, TCE contaminated water, unknowingly, and a person from that community developed Parkinson's disease. Let's see. Has COVID research cut into Parkinson's research? So, but to one, you should all be thanking Michael J. Fox. So Michael J. Fox as an individual has made, one, it takes a lot of courage to expose your illness and your health issues to the public. It takes a lot of courage to expose your health issues and say that, yeah, I got a neurodegenerative condition, and expose that to the public. So one, that's a lot of courage. Two, he's reduced a ton of the stigma associated with Parkinson's disease. Some of you probably told your friends that you have the disease that Michael J. Fox has. Michael J. Fox is he's Canadian, but he's probably one of the most well-regarded people in the United States. Three, they've raised $1 billion, almost $1 billion of research for Parkinson's research over the last 20 years. That said, we need a lot more, and we need to focus it on helping prevent people getting the disease. So if you look, the biggest funder of research across, by far, biggest funder of research is the NIH, spends over $30 billion a year on research. I told you $3 billion goes to HIV. Parkinson's gets about $200 million. Over the last 10 years, the number of Americans with Parkinson's disease has increased by 35%. So if you know more friends and family members with Parkinson's disease and you think it's more common, you're right, because the number of Americans with Parkinson's has increased by 35% over the last 10 years. NIH funding over that same time, when you adjust for inflation, has decreased. I know of no other condition where the number of people affected with the disease has gone up by 35% and the funding from the NIH for Parkinson's research has decreased. My colleague Michael Oken says we need to increase Parkinson's research tenfold. Tenfold, that's what Michael Oken thinks we should be doing, because it worked for HIV. It's the most treatable condition. It's more treatable than Parkinson's disease. It's preventable, and we have treatments that in the future could lead to the eradication over time of of HIV through prevention, by just preventing. If you treat enough people, you reduce the viral loads of the virus in their blood, and so that the risk of transmission approaches nil. So funding for HIV research has changed the course of that disease. Funding for Parkinson's research has decreased at the same time, but the number of Americans with the disease has gone up by 35%. If that doesn't make you boil, and if you don't hold your politicians accountable to funding of a disease that you're going to live with for the next 15 to 20 years, that's on you. You guys are all well-versed. You're generally well-connected. You need to make this, your voices heard. We wrote this book to empower all of you to make your voices heard, to adopt a motto of not silence equals death, but silence equals suffering, and it's needless suffering. And we know you suffer a lot more than you let on, but it's on you. No one is going to be more motivated to change the course of Parkinson's disease than people who are most directly affected by it. And it's not neurologists that change the course of diseases, it's people like you. So if you don't get fired up by the fact that Parkinson's research has decreased in the setting of 35% increase number of people with the disease, I don't know what will get you fired up. Can you comment on the new bill, Eileen, on Congress Protect America's Children from the Toxic Pesticide Act of 2020? So this was the bill I introduced, mentioned earlier, Senator Tom Udall. So Senator Tom Udall's uncle, Morris K. Udall, had Parkinson's disease. He was a congressman for 30 years. He served in Congress with the disease for about, I think, the last 8 to 12 years. There are 8 NIH-funded Parkinson's research centers across the country. We're fortunate to be one at the University of Rochester, and we work with colleagues at Johns Hopkins and MIT and others to develop better measures of the disease. And many of you might be participating in some of our research studies, which are open to people around the country. And so Senator Udall, his nephew, introduced this bill. He's been a fierce advocate for Parkinson's research. So if you live in New Mexico, or you just want to send Senator Tom Udall a note and say, thank you for all your efforts for Parkinson's disease, that would be great. Unfortunately, he's retiring at the end of this term, so we're going to lose a major advocate for Parkinson's research in Congress with his retirement. But he's introduced a bill that would change the way we regulate pesticides. In the United States, for a drug to be approved by the FDA, it must be safe and effective. A drug must be safe and effective. There are unsafe pesticides on the market today that shouldn't be there. There are unsafe pesticides. So we have stricter regulations for drugs than we do for pesticides. Pesticide, I'll tell you one, Paraquat. So Paraquat is considered introduced in the 1950s. So think about 1950s. Would you drive in a car from the 1950s or fly in an airplane from the 1950s? My guess is no. Second, it's considered the most toxic herbicide ever created. Third, it kills the weeds that Roundup doesn't. 4, it's so toxic, it's been used to commit homicide and suicide. Studies have demonstrated people have used Paraquat to kill people, homicide and suicides. In fact, I think it was introduced in South Korea. I can't remember, it's in the book. Introduced in South Korea, a number of farmers committing suicide rose, and then when it was banned, the number of suicides went down. The EPA's own website, this is craziness. I'm going to show it to you. The EPA's own website says this about about Paraquat. So, and we show this in the book. So this is the EPA's own website. So that's Paraquat. 1 sip can kill. So it's 1 sip can kill. Recent deaths from accidental ingestion of Paraquat. I'm going to read you one of these things. It gets me so upset. In 2008, a 8-year-old boy drank Paraquat that had been put in a Dr. Pepper bottle, which he found on a windowsill in the garage. He died in the hospital 16 days later. His older brother had used the product on weeds around the house and put the bottle in the garage. The older brother obtained the product from a family friend who's a certified restricted use pesticide applicator. So the Paraquat manufacturers will tell you that Paraquat's safe if used as directed. But here's an 8-year-old kid who's inadvertently killed because of the actions of his 16-year-old brother putting Paraquat in a Dr. Pepper bottle. And we still use it. Not only do we still use it, but 32 countries, including China, have banned Paraquat. So China banned Paraquat for public health because it was an interest of the public's health. China's banned it, Syria's banned it, the United Arab Emirates has banned it, England has banned it. England has banned Paraquat and exports it to the United States. England has banned Paraquat and exports it to the United States, exports it to Mexico, exports it to Brazil. Someone asked the question, if I live in the United Kingdom, someone lives in the United Kingdom, hello to the British, and they export Paraquat and then they import pet food that has been sprayed on with Paraquat. Not only has the United States not banned Paraquat, but use of Paraquat, according to the United States Geological Service, has more than doubled in the last 10 years. So not only has the United States failed to ban Paraquat, despite 100,000 signatures from the Michael J. Fox Foundation and others, and maybe some of you, thank you, but use has doubled over the last 10 years. So in the book, we outline a pact to prevent, advocate, care, and treat Parkinson's disease. And these black pages at the back of the book are the prescription for action. So we're docs, so we wrote a prescription for action. And the very first prescription for action is to ban Paraquat and trichloroethylene. And so you can email Andrew Wheeler, he's the EPA administrator. I give you his email address, wheeler.andrew@epa.gov, and you can call him 202-564-4700 and let him know. I called his office, I sent him a copy of the book, and I even sent him a nice note telling him that it's time to ban Paraquat. But if 1.1 million Americans who have Parkinson's disease email him or call him and flood his inbox saying that we're not going to vote for a certain candidate unless you guys start to ban Paraquat and start to prevent people from getting Parkinson's disease, that will change the course of the disease. 1.1 million Americans have it. Some of you have Parkinson's disease because of Paraquat. Some of you have Parkinson's disease because of Paraquat. I don't know anyone who wants to have Parkinson's disease. Many of you have said, I wouldn't even want my enemies to have Parkinson's disease. Some of you have Parkinson's disease because of Paraquat. We need to ban Paraquat. Yeah, Alice will give you a link for the PD Avengers. Yvonne Hackey, I'm from a wine region and they have France, the Loire, sorry, my French is terrible, the Loire Vallée. They were spraying like crazy in the 1960s. Some pesticides that were banned might be coming back. The EU is fighting, but it's not banned here. Yeah, so vineyards are used a lot of pesticides. I think I read to you that there's a study in France that looked at the vineyards, that areas of France that were using vineyards. The more vineyards they had, the more pesticides were used, and the more Parkinson's disease. It was almost a perfect correlation. You couldn't make it up. They had 15 vineyards, 15 areas of France, and they ranked them by number of vineyards and pesticide exposure, and it was almost perfectly that the top 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and the rates of Parkinson's disease. So if I had Parkinson's disease and I grew up near a vineyard, I'd be very suspicious and very pissed off. And it's still going on. My grandfather had apple orchards in a garden he sprayed with pesticides. He developed Parkinson's disease. My half-brother has Parkinson's disease, myself as well. Does the effect of these pesticides transverse generations? So one, you should be getting recurring themes. Two, not everyone who's exposed to pesticides develops Parkinson's disease. So not every farmer gets Parkinson's disease, for example. Not everyone who smokes gets lung cancer. In fact, only 10% of people who smoke get lung cancer. So there have to be other genetic and other environmental factors that lead to the disease. It is unlikely, but not entirely known, but unlikely that if you were not exposed to the pesticides, that if you were not exposed to the pesticides, you probably are not at increased risk for it, likely. That said, it turns out when are people most susceptible to the harmful effects of pesticides? When they're young. So we told you about the study about the children losing 15 million IQ points. And I told you about the cows concentrating the pesticides in their milk. Well, who else concentrates pesticides in their milk? Women. So women, nursing women, you find the pesticides in the milk of nursing women. And where's that milk, who that consumes that milk? They're babies. Who has developing relatively unprotected brains? Babies. So you can see the levels of pesticides in nursing women. You can still see elevated areas of elevated levels of pesticides in nursing women today in different parts of the world. We detail that in the book. And who's developing the harmful effects of that? Their children. And so we know that it may be just like smoking. You don't smoke cigarettes for 2 days and then develop Parkinson's lung cancer the next day. It takes decades later. Same with Parkinson's, that your pesticide exposure could have been when you were a child. And then as you live longer and longer, those nerve cells start dying off and you stop being able to compensate for the effects, and then the Parkinson's disease emerges. So just because you weren't exposed today doesn't mean you weren't exposed 20 years ago, 30 years ago, 40 years ago, 50 years ago, or even from your mother. And this is like real. So they even find effects of these fat-soluble pesticides in our fatty tissue. So they do biopsies of humans' fat. You can find elevated levels of DDT and its metabolites, DDE, in people's fat today. Do you recommend against dairy or grain? So I think the main concern with dairy is, are you getting milk that could have been contaminated by pesticides, especially fat-soluble ones? Many of the fat-soluble pesticides in the United States have been banned. So I drink milk, and I have 4 boys, and one like devours milk. So we buy our milk from safer farms that are less likely to use pesticides, but it's, I think, less of a concern in the United States, but still a concern in many parts of the world that are using these. If a country can ban DDT, what's the issue with banning Paraquat? Great question. I don't have an answer. Too much government control or lobbying. Well, there you go. And not enough people arguing. If 1 million people made their voices heard and emailed Andrew Wheeler saying we want to ban Paraquat and we're not voting for Donald Trump for re-election unless Paraquat's banned, they'll get a message. And there are a lot of people with Parkinson's disease hanging out in swing states like Florida and Michigan. And let me just show you this map. So here's Paraquat. This is where Paraquat's used. So you can see where Paraquat's used. I don't even know where I'm speaking today, but it's used in large parts of the world. This is the thing about the cows eating the pesticide sprayed pineapples. It's found in their milk. People drink the milk. The milk is then, nursing women drink the milk. They feed their babies, and their babies get exposed. And then we put it all in here. We got nice tables. Here's a list of the countries that have banned Paraquat beginning in 1983 and then all the way through 2008. So, 40 years ago. Here's our one sip can kill. Here's the graph of Paraquat over the last 10 years use from the U.S. Geological Service. This is the EPA. These are like credible sources, right? This isn't like, investigative journalism. This is the EPA's own website. Let's see. I grew up in the age of DDT, says Robert Nadel, when any crawly creature was dealt with spray. Yes, I was also a motion picture projectionist and used a carbon tetrachloride glue to cement films for years before we used tape. That's been linked to cancer, I think less clear to Parkinson's disease. Also was exposed to Paraquat with the ear of cracking down on the importation of reefer from Mexico. So Paraquat was used by Mexicans, by farms growing cannabis, marijuana, and then that marijuana been imported into the United States, and people are getting exposed to Paraquat by that way. If you've seen the movie The Big Lebowski, there's a scene in there in which they talk about Paraquat and marijuana. And then if you've read, I'll see what I got here. Hold on. I get so upset. So the New York Times had a nice article on the link between environmental chemicals and Parkinson's disease. And if you haven't seen this, I think Alistair will put the URL in the website. And so this is the article and the link between Parkinson's disease and atomic chemicals, and highlights that our book calls increasing prominence of Parkinson's a man-made pandemic. And there are comments from 147 people who are just like you, including one person who talks about this exposure to marijuana and Paraquat, and talks a lot of stories that are just like the ones you do. I grew up on a farm. I was exposed to these pesticides, and I developed Parkinson's disease. My father served in Vietnam or served in World War II. was exposed to these chemicals and developed Parkinson's disease. The stories go on and on and on. Every time I read them, I get upset because it's bad things happen to people, but we need to prevent bad things from happening to people when we know how to prevent them. So some things we don't know how to prevent, but we know how to prevent Parkinson's disease and we're not doing it. And so this is an article that details some of that. We'll add the Andrew Wheeler's email address again to the chat. It is wheeler.andrew@epa.gov, and Alistair will put that in there, wheeler.andrew@epa.gov. Let's see, oh my goodness. Oh my goodness, okay. Okay, does the toxicity of pesticides on fruits and vegetables diminish when they are cooked? I'm not sure about cooked, but pesticides, just like everything's either water soluble, dissolves in water, or dissolves in fat. And so that's why I wash my fruits with water and a little bit of soap that you can get from any grocery store, for a couple bucks. Millions of people exposed to pesticides, but not everyone gets Parkinson's. Why do some not? Why do some get it and some not? And someone also asked about environmental causes. So, genetic causes. So about 15% of people with Parkinson's disease have a family history of Parkinson's disease. This has been known for about 150 years. Said another way, 85% of people with Parkinson's disease do not have a family history of Parkinson's disease. And then 20 years ago, Dr. Carly Tanner did a study of identical twins and fraternal twins. And if something has a huge genetic factor, that means that identical twins should be much more likely to share the disease than fraternal twins. But she found out that the rates of Parkinson's disease were similar between identical and fraternal twins, suggesting that for most people, especially with onset after 50, that environmental causes are the primary reason for Parkinson's disease. We have known from a woman, Dr. Carly Tanner, for over 20 years that environmental causes are the primary reason for Parkinson's disease, especially for those who develop over age 50. Now, there are some genetic causes, including LRRK2, a mutation in a gene called LRRK2, and another gene called GBA, and others. These genes are relatively rare, maybe accounting for 2 to 3% for LRRK2, maybe 4 to 5% of people with the GBA mutation. Altogether, less than 10 to 15%, just like the 10 to 15% that have a family history. It turns out you carry one of these genetic mutations, you're not guaranteed to develop Parkinson's disease, but almost every genetic mutation that's been identified, linked to Parkinson's disease has an interaction with pesticides. So if you want to know why some people develop Parkinson's disease and some don't, it could be because of genetic factors. One of my colleagues says, genetics loads the gun and the environment pulls the trigger. And if we stop smoking, we stop getting rid of lung cancer regardless of your genetics. If we stop using pesticides and industrial chemicals, I propose to you that we get rid of Parkinson's disease largely regardless of your genetics. There are very, 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 very few genetic causes that are entirely due to less than 1 in 10,000, even probably less than that. And then there are also environmental factors. So for example, pesticides, when animal models exposed to pesticides and then head trauma have a much higher risk of developing Parkinson's disease than animals exposed to just pesticides or just head trauma. And people exposed to one pesticide can be exposed to another pesticide. And interaction of the 2 pesticides, and many people are exposed to multiple pesticides, can lead to even greater nerve cell loss. So there are plenty of reasons why some individuals get exposed to a toxin and develop disease and others don't. Again, the lung cancer example is a great one. Only 10% of people exposed to something known to cause lung cancer, only 10% of smokers develop lung cancer. Terry says, hello, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge. How dangerous is it to swim in chlorinated water in pools? I don't think it's dangerous at all from a Parkinson's disease standpoint. There's no clear evidence to my knowledge of links between chlorinated water and Parkinson's disease. This other chemical is trichloroethylene, but it's not the chlorine that's put into swimming pools. Why was the PD Avengers created? Why need you to join forces we need you to join forces with us to get our job done. That's why I'm here on a Sunday afternoon, is to help you get educated and get you fired up. So I agree with you completely. And that's why we wrote the book. And that's why I'm going to send you the book for free if you need a copy of the book. And that's why I'm happy to go wherever you tell me to go and speak to wherever you want me to speak to do that. And the PD Avengers was created to help rally and change the course of the disease. I'm not saying neurologists play no role, but it doesn't matter what, no one cares what a neurologist thinks. No one cares what a neurologist thinks. But if 1.1 million people email the EPA administrator, you can bet that the EPA will get the message. If they don't get the message, 1.1 million people change the way they vote, they'll get the message. Alistair provides you the link to this new legislation that Senator Tom Udall do. Robert Nadal goes, I'm an Ashkenazi Jew whose father, maternal grandfather had Parkinson's, and I carry the LRRK2 mutation. So LRRK2 is this very common cause, relatively speaking, most common genetic cause of Parkinson's. Affects about 2 to 3% of people who have Parkinson's as general. But if you're Ashkenazi Jew and you have Parkinson's, up to 20% of the cases are due to the genetic mutation. It's passed on in a 50-50 chance from parents to their children. So I have a LRRK2 mutation. On average, 50% of my children will also carry that mutation. The risk of Parkinson's for those who carry LRRK2 mutation varies from about 20% to 40% or more. As you age, as there's more time more time passes, the risk of Parkinson's goes up. So if you're age 20 of a LRRK2 mutation, your risk of Parkinson's is essentially nil. But if you're age 80, the risk of Parkinson's might be 40% or higher. And again, LRRK2 is known to have genetic interactions with pesticides. So if I had a LRRK2 mutation, I would be all organic. I'd be washing my fruits and vegetables constantly and be hyper vigilant about it. I'd be wearing a helmet so I don't get a head trauma. I would be avoiding, I would put a carbon filter on my water. These are the carbon filters that you just put on your spouts as the water comes out. So you're less likely to get exposed to chemicals like TCE, which is the most common groundwater contaminant in the United States. I would be eating a Mediterranean diet. I'd be exercising. Vigorous exercise has been shown to decrease, in your 50s and 60s, has been shown to decrease your risk of developing Parkinson's by about 20% in pretty good studies. And all of you know that the exercise is a huge benefit to people with the disease. So if you're not exercising at least an hour a day and you have the health ability to do so, you should start. And then there are drugs being targeted at the LRRK2 genetic causes. So there are some LRRK2 inhibitors. So the mutation causes this protein called LRRK2 to become inappropriately overactive. And there are drugs in development that will likely be around that will have answers about whether they're effective enough in the next 5 years or so. And those could be very promising treatments for those who have a LRRK2 mutation, and even those who don't, because some of these chemicals like TCE mimic the effects of the genetic mutations and lead to overactivity of these LRRK2 genes.
Ray, I'm gonna stop right here. I think there's maybe questions. I want to thank you. It's been so informational, and it's just been terrific. I am going to post, I'm going to send an email out to everybody who registered with all of the links that Alistair has given us, which are a lot. And everybody should sign on to PD Avengers, become a PD Avenger. I know several of the people on this call have already signed up. Christy, I know you have. Lauren, I think, and I'm not sure who else, but I know that there are a number of people on the call. And we need to make our voices heard, just like the people with HIV did so in the 80s, and the women with breast cancer did so in the 80s and 90s. We can make a difference. So I want to thank you so much. I'm going to leave this open if anybody wants to stay on and ask more questions or talk to each other. I will keep the line open for about a half an hour. We had a problem with our Facebook stream, but I will put this up on Facebook once I get the recording. So,
and can I just conclude? Can I just say it's the people who change the course of the diseases are ordinary people, ordinary, in some way cases, extraordinary people who are just like you. And we benefited from the activism of people on polio, and we don't have polio. We benefit from the activity of HIV activists, and fewer of us have HIV. And those of us who do have more effective treatments, and we benefit from MAD. So these are women, right? Mothers largely who suffered, terribly with, often a death of their child. And they didn't just suffer in silence. They got angry and they got upset, and they changed the course of and social perceptions around drunk driving. we do the same, we will be the generation that ends Parkinson's disease, prevents and ends Parkinson's disease. And if we don't, the number of people with this disease, the number of people who suffer like you will only double, and will continue to have the world's fastest growing brain disease.
Well, I want to thank you, and I had it, there it is. We have a virtual crown for you. We usually get a tiara, but you get a crown. Thank you, thank you, thank you. With much appreciation. It has been a very interesting and informative morning. Coming up soon in next month, we only have one session in September, and that is yoga for Parkinson's. It is going to be a wonderful session. October 18th, we have Linda K. Olson, and I included her video on the, oh, I lost it. Anyway, I included her video on the promo. She was in a car that was hit by a train, lost both legs and one arm, ended up having 2 children, and then developed Parkinson's. And the video I gave you is from the World Parkinson's Congress last year, where she was a keynote speaker, and she is amazing. So if you want inspiration, she will give you inspiration. And she might even be on this call today, I'm not sure. So thank you, everybody. And if you are not on, I know some of you are not subscribers to Twitchy Woman. This is the website. Just go to twitchywoman.com. You can get my blog, and I will continue to post information that has been presented today.